In the heart of a kingdom steeped in emerald forests and rivers that wound like silver ribbons, where tradition was the very air people breathed, there lived a love story so defiant, so audacious, it threatened to unravel the ancient tapestry. Of power, this isn't a fairy tale, though. It begins with a prince in a palace. This is a testament to the raw, unyielding force of the human heart, force that cares nothing for birthright or decree, only for connection. And sometimes, connection can be a dangerous, even deadly thing. Our story begins not in the sun-drenched grand halls of the royal palace, but in its forgotten corners, where shadows clung like old secrets and the whispers of unseen lives faded into the ornate walls. Here, among the lowest rungs of the palace hierarchy, worked a young woman named Aisha. She was a wisp of a girl, barely 18, with skin the color of rich, dark earth, eyes that were pools of liquid obsidian perpetually, wide with a mixture of apprehension and an unyielding spark of resilience. Her movements were swift, almost furtive, as if she perpetually feared being caught, even when she was doing nothing wrong. Her hands, though calloused from endless toil, possessed a surprising grace as she polished the endless silver, folded mountains of linen, or swept the mosaic floors until they gleamed. Aisha, unlike the other maids, carried a quiet dignity, a silent strength that belied her small frame and the constant, subtle humiliation of her station. She never complained, never raised her voice, a quality that only seemed to infuriate those who reveled in their power over her. The palace itself was a labyrinth of opulence and rigid protocol, a gleaming testament to the ancient lineage of the royal family. Its walls, constructed from a rare sun-baked clay, shimmered with embedded flecks of mica, giving them an almost living quality. Courtyards bloomed with exotic flowers, their perfumes heavy on the humid air, and fountains gurgled with water carried from distant mountain springs. At its center, presiding over this intricate world, was King Theron, a man whose every utterance was law, whose every glance could inspire both fear and unwavering loyalty. He was a figure of immense presence, his broad shoulders and towering height accentuated by the rich, flowing robes he always wore. His face etched with the lines of command and wisdom, often held a stern, unyielding expression. His eyes like polished jade, missing nothing. Beside him, a more subtle, yet equally formidable force, was Queen Seraphina. Her beauty was legendary, a sculpted elegance that seemed almost ethereal, yet beneath it lay a will of iron. Her long, dark hair, always intricately braided and adorned with gold, framed a face that rarely betrayed emotion, her lips often curved into a polite, enigmatic smile that concealed a sharp, calculating mind. And then there was Prince Jabari, the kingdom's hope, its future, its very heart. Jabari was everything a prince should be, and yet profoundly he was not. He possessed the striking good looks of his parents, the king's commanding height, the queen's refined features, but his eyes, unlike his father's jade orbs, were a warm, fathomless brown, often alight with a restless curiosity that seemed ill-suited to the stoic confines of royal life. He moved with an effortless grace, his body lean and athletic from years of training in martial arts and horsemanship. Unlike the gilded cages many princes inhabited, Jabari often found solace outside the palace walls, exploring the kingdoms, vast, wild landscapes, speaking with common folk, his mind always seeking understanding beyond the gilded narratives spun by courtiers. It was this restless spirit, this yearning for something more authentic, that set him apart and ultimately put him on a collision course with destiny. The palace buzzed with 1,000 lives, 1,000 stories, yet it was a world of rigid separation. The royal family moved in one orbit, the courtiers in another, and the servants in yet another. Their paths rarely intersecting, their worlds rarely touching, save for the fleeting moments of service. Aisha was a ghost in this grand house, seen but rarely acknowledged. Her presence as ephemeral as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that occasionally pierced the high windows. Her days were a monotonous cycle of rising before dawn, working tirelessly until long after dusk, fueled by meager rations and the quiet hum of her own enduring spirit. She knew her place. She understood the unspoken rules, and she never dared to dream beyond them, not consciously at least. But fate, it seems, has a perverse sense of humor. It delights in shattering expectations, in weaving unlikely threads into the grand tapestry of life. And so, it was inevitable that the path of the prince and the maid would cross. Not in a grand ballroom, not during a royal procession, but in the most unassuming of places, the palace library. Jabari often sought refuge there, surrounded by the scent of aged parchment and forgotten wisdom. He found solace in the stories of heroes and commoners, of love and loss, far removed from the endless political machinations of the court. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows through the arched windows, Jabari was lost in a particularly ancient tome. He barely registered the soft creak of the door, the almost silent entrance of Aisha, whose duty it was to tend to the vast collection. Dusting the shelves, arranging the scrolls, she moved with her usual quiet efficiency, her movements fluid and practiced. Jabari, engrossed in his reading, initially paid her no mind. But then, a soft, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips as she reached for a particularly high shelf. Her small frame stretching, struggling. A stack of scrolls, precariously balanced, began to teeter. Without thinking, Jabari instinctively reached out, his hand catching the falling scrolls just before they crashed to the polished floor. His fingers brushed against hers, a fleeting touch, electrifying in its unexpectedness. Aisha froze, her eyes wide with surprise, and a flash of fear met his. In that moment, time seemed to expand, the dusty air of the library filled with an unspoken recognition. He had never truly seen her before. Not really. She was always a blur, a figure in the background. But now, truly looking at her, he was struck by the intensity of her gaze, the fragile strength in her posture. There was a quiet intelligence in her eyes, a depth that belied her humble station. Aisha, for her part, was equally stunned. To be addressed, to be seen by the prince, was an unimaginable breach of protocol. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She stammered a quiet apology, her voice a soft murmur, barely audible, however, simply smiled, a genuine, open smile that rarely graced his features in the company of courtiers. "No harm done," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, innocuous to anyone else, but to Aisha it was a lifeline, an acknowledgement of her existence. No one, not since her own mother passed years ago, had ever asked her if she was all right. This small, seemingly insignificant interaction, barely a minute long, planted a seed of curiosity in Jabari, a seed of bewildered hope in Aisha. From that day forward, their paths, once so disparate, began to subtly converge. Jabari found himself lingering in the library longer, feigning interest in obscure texts, just to catch a glimpse of her. He would observe her from afar, fascinated by her quiet diligence, her unspoken resilience. He noticed the way the other maids treated her, the snide remarks, subtle exclusions, the heavy burdens they often piled upon her. A slow burn of indignation began to smolder within him. Aisha, acutely aware of his presence, would feel a strange warmth spread through her whenever he was near. She would try to remain impassive, to maintain her invisible status. But a subtle tremor would pass through her whenever his gaze lingered. A moment too long, she began to notice his habits. The way he would run a hand through his dark, curly hair when deep in thought, the faint scent of jasmine that always seemed to cling to him, the rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. It was a dangerous game, this silent dance of observation and subtle acknowledgement. A game played on the precipice of unspoken rules, where a single misstep could lead to ruin. One evening, a particularly violent storm lashed against the palace, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rattling the ancient foundations. The electricity, prone to flickering in such conditions, gave out, plunging vast sections of the palace into darkness. Panic rippled through the servant quarters. Aisha, trying to navigate a treacherous, unlit corridor with a heavy basket of laundry, stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully. She bit back a cry, clutching her injured foot. It was then, a faint flicker of candlelight appearing in the gloom, that Jabari emerged, holding a lantern aloft. He had been checking on the perimeter guards, a restless energy driving him out, into the tempest. He saw her, crumpled on the floor, her face pale with pain. "Aisha," he exclaimed, his voice sharp with concern. He knelt beside her, his lamp illuminating her strained face. "Are you hurt?" He didn't wait for an answer, gently examining her swollen ankle. His touch was careful, surprisingly gentle. Aisha, overwhelmed by the sudden intimacy by his genuine Aisha. Concern could only nod, tears pricking at her eyes, not just from the pain, but from the sheer, unexpected kindness. He helped her up, supporting her weight as they slowly made their way to the infirmary, the only part of the palace that still had dim emergency lighting. He stayed with her as the palace healer bandaged her foot, ensuring she was comfortable, even bringing her a cup of warm, spiced tea. This act of undeniable compassion, so far removed from the cold formality of palace life, solidified something. In both of them, for Aisha, it was a confirmation that the prince was not like the others, that he possessed a heart that saw beyond status. For Jabari, it was a revelation. He felt a fierce, protective instinct bloom within him, a desire to shield her from the harsh realities of her existence. He saw her not just as a maid, but as a person, a brave, resilient soul enduring injustice. With quiet grace, he began to seek her out more openly, though always with a degree of discretion. He would find excuses to be in the areas where she worked, engaging her in quiet conversation. He learned about her life, her dreams simple, dreams of peace, of dignity, of a life free from the constant burden of servitude. He told her about his own frustrations, the heavy weight of expectation, the gilded cage of his destiny. Their conversations became clandestine moments of shared vulnerability, whispered words in forgotten corridors, stolen glances across crowded rooms. They spoke of books, of the outside world, of their deepest longings. Aisha, initially hesitant, slowly began to shed her shell, revealing a keen intellect, a dry wit, and a profound empathy. Jabari found himself drawn to her unwavering spirit, to the quiet strength that shone through her dark eyes. He began to feel a pull, a magnetic force that defied all reason and societal norms. He was falling in love. And with every shared glance, every hushed word, Aisha felt herself falling too, into a whirlpool of emotions she had never dared to imagine. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly irrevocably reckless. But love, when it blooms in forbidden gardens, inevitably attracts the attention of those who guard the walls. The palace was a place of whispers and watchful eyes. Servants, ever eager to curry favor, began to notice the prince's unusual interest in the quiet maid. Nods and knowing glances were exchanged. The subtle shifts in the palace hierarchy sensed, and amongst those who watched, none were more observant or more malevolent than Zola, the head maid. Zola was a woman built like a fortress, her face a mask of perpetual disapproval, her eyes like chips of flint. She had worked in the palace for decades, her entire identity wrapped up in her position and the power it afforded her over the younger, more vulnerable staff. She resented Aisha's quiet dignity, her refusal to be broken, and now, this unspeakable transgression. Zola saw Aisha as a threat, an affront to the established order, and a direct challenge to her own authority. Zola began to escalate her persecution of Aisha. The already arduous tasks became unbearable. Aisha was given the heaviest loads, the dirtiest chores, the longest hours. She was frequently rebuked for imagined infractions, publicly shamed for minor errors. The other maids, terrified of Zola's wrath, either joined in the subtle torment or remained silently complicit, their eyes averting whenever Aisha passed. Aisha endured it all with a quiet stoicism, her jaw clenched, her gaze fixed on some distant point. But the emotional toll was immense. She grew thinner, her eyes shadowed, the spark in them dimming under the relentless onslaught. She knew what this was about. She knew what Zola suspected. The knowledge filled her with a dread that was colder than any winter wind. Jabari, though often secluded in his studies or royal duties, was not oblivious. He saw the changes in Aisha, the subtle signs of her suffering. He tried to intervene, subtly at first, by requesting Aisha for specific tasks that would remove her from Zola's direct purview, or by leaving small, comforting gifts apiece, a fruit, a carefully chosen book where she would find them. But these acts, while providing brief respite, only fueled Zola's malice, confirming her suspicions. The headmaid saw the prince's attention as a direct insult, a challenge to her authority, an inexcusable breach of the caste system she so fiercely upheld. The situation escalated dramatically one afternoon during a royal luncheon. The palace dining hall was a cavernous space, filled with the murmur of polite conversation, the clinking of silver, and the rich aromas of a dozen exotic dishes. Aisha, serving at a side table, accidentally brushed against a vase of delicate porcelain, sending it teetering precariously. Before she could steady it, Zola, who had been hovering nearby, seized the opportunity. With a theatrical gasp, Zola lunged, pushing the vase with exaggerated force, sending it crashing to the marble floor with a deafening shatter. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. All eyes turned to Aisha, who stood frozen, her face drained. "Of color, clumsy girl!" Zola shrieked, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "This priceless antiquity, ruined by your incompetence. Such disrespect for the royal family." Her words were venom, designed to humiliate, to condemn. The king and queen, seated at the head table, looked on with stern faces, their expressions unreadable. Jabari, however, reacted instantly. He rose from his seat, his eyes blazing with an uncharacteristic fury. He was about to speak, to defend Aisha, to expose Zola's malicious lie, when a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture from his mother, a slight shake of her head, stopped him cold. He understood the silent warning, in front of the assembled court. Such an intervention would only confirm the rumors, solidify the scandal, and potentially endanger Aisha even more. He swallowed his anger, his jaw tightening, his fists clenching beneath the table. Aisha, seeing his silent struggle, understanding the impossible position he was in, felt a profound wave of despair wash over her. She knew, in that moment, that she was truly alone. The queen's gaze, cold and analytical, settled on Aisha, a silent verdict passing between them. Zola, emboldened by the royal silence, continued her tirade, painting Aisha as not just incompetent, but maliciously disrespectful. The king, after a moment of contemplation, spoke, his voice low, but carrying absolute authority. "This cannot be tolerated," he declared, his eyes sweeping over the nervous assembly. "Such carelessness reflects poorly on the entire palace staff." His gaze then lingered on Aisha, a chilling finality in his tone. "Aisha, you are hereby dismissed from your duties. You will leave the palace grounds by sunset." The words hung in the air, a death knell. Dismissed, ostracized, cast out. Aisha felt the world tilt on its axis. Her few meager belongings, her entire existence, were confined to these walls. Where would she go? What would she do? She dared not look at Jabari, for fear her own devastation would betray the depth of their forbidden connection. Jabari, however, met her gaze, a silent apology in his eyes, a promise forming in his heart. But it was a promise he could not yet voice for the eyes of the entire court. And more importantly, his parents were upon him. The news of Aisha's dismissal spread like wildfire through the palace. The other maids, relieved it wasn't them, avoided her like a plague. Zola, triumphant, watched as Aisha gathered her few possessions, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Aisha moved like a ghost, her spirit broken, her hope extinguished. She felt the weight of every judging gaze, every whispered accusation. The air outside the palace walls, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a terrifying, boundless unknown. She walked away from the only home she had ever known, carrying nothing but a small, worn cloth bag and the crushing burden of a forbidden love. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Aisha walked, the dusty road leading away from the kingdom. She had no destination, no plan. Only the desperate need to put distance between herself and the humiliation she had suffered. Her heart ached, not just for her lost position, but for the unspoken connection she was leaving behind. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would likely never see Prince Jabari again. Their story, she believed, was over before it had truly begun. But love, true love, is not so easily extinguished. It is a stubborn, resilient force that defies logic, transcends boundaries, and laughs in the face of despair. Aisha walked into the fading light, a silent, desperate prayer on her lips. She was unaware of the storm brewing behind her, a storm ignited by a prince who refused to let fate dictate his heart. She was unaware that her departure was not an ending, but merely the dramatic, agonizing beginning of a far grander, far more perilous journey. The clock was ticking, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. The story of Aisha and Jabari, far from over, was just about to truly begin. The chill that settled over the kingdom. That evening wasn't just the natural cooling of the desert air. It was the chill of a decision made in haste, a decree born of pride and prejudice. For Aisha, it was the cold hand of despair gripping her heart. For Jabari, it was the icy fury of injustice, igniting a fire he could no longer suppress. He had watched her go, a tiny, solitary figure silhouetted against the dying embers of the sunset. And with every step she took away from the palace, a piece of his own soul seemed to tear free. The lavish dinner, the polite chatter, the very air of opulence in the dining hall now felt like a suffocating shroud. His food tasted like ash, the music grating, the faces of his family, once symbols of comfort and authority, now seemed alien, unyielding. The moment Aisha vanished from sight, the carefully constructed facade around Prince Jabari began to crack. He retreated to his chambers, the silk and gold of his room feeling more like a prison than a sanctuary. The whispers of the courtiers, the knowing glances of the servants, all confirmed his deepest fear. His unspoken connection with Aisha had not gone unnoticed. His mother, Queen Seraphina, a woman who saw political maneuvering in every shadow, approached him later that evening. Her voice was soft, laced with a deceptive sweetness, but her eyes, those pools of calculated intellect, were sharp and unblinking. She spoke of duty, of the royal line, of the unfortunate incident with the maid. Such distractions, she purred, are beneath a prince of your standing. You must remember your future, Jabari. A future intertwined with the stability of this kingdom, not with transient affections. Her words were meant to soothe, to subtly redirect, but they only served to fuel his simmering rage. He saw the cold calculation in her eyes, the complete disregard for Aisha's humanity. He saw the injustice, naked and unashamed. His father, King Theron, approached the matter with his usual stoicism. A prince's heart, the king stated, his voice a low rumble, belongs to his people, not to whims of sentiment. This girl, Aisha, was a distraction. Her presence in the palace caused unease. It was a necessary decision. Necessary for whom, Jabari wondered, his blood boiling. Necessary for the preservation of an outdated order, for the fragile illusion of their perfect, untainted lineage. He held his tongue, knowing a direct confrontation would be futile, perhaps even disastrous for Aisha, wherever she now was. A resolve, hard and unyielding, began to crystallize within him. He would find her, no matter the cost. As darkness deepened, cloaking the palace in a deceptive tranquility, Jabari made his preparations. He was a master of evasion, a skilled horseman, and knew the hidden paths of the kingdom better than any guard. He gathered only what was essential: a sturdy cloak, a pouch of gold coins, a small, intricate compass, and a dagger concealed beneath his tunic. He left no note, no explanation, for he knew they would only hinder his escape. His heart was a drumbeat in his chest, a frantic rhythm of fear and fierce determination. He imagined Aisha, alone and vulnerable, walking into the vast unknown. He pictured her tired eyes, her small, brave frame, and the thought spurred him forward. Under the cloak of the deepest night, just as the moon began its descent, Jabari slipped out of the palace. He bypassed the main gates, knowing they would be heavily guarded, and instead used a little-known service exit, a narrow passage often used by provisioners. He moved with the silent grace of a hunter, his mind already miles ahead, charting his course. His stallion, a magnificent black mare named Shadow, waited patiently in a small, concealed grove just beyond the palace walls. Shadow was as swift as the wind and as loyal as a brother. Jabari vaulted onto her back, and with a whispered command, they were off, galloping into the moonless night, leaving behind the suffocating opulence of his birthright. But the kingdom was vast, and Aisha had no real destination. She simply walked, guided by instinct, driven by despair, taking the dusty, winding paths that led away from the capital. She was a lamb cast out into the wilderness. The world outside the palace walls was far harsher, far less forgiving than anything she had ever known. The nights were colder, the shadows deeper, and the loneliness a crushing weight. She sought refuge in abandoned lean-tos, under the sparse shelter of ancient baobab trees. Her few coins quickly dwindled, spent on meager scraps of food from reluctant villagers who eyed her with suspicion, sensing her plight. Her lack of belonging, days bled into nights, each one a struggle for survival. The physical hardship was immense, but it was the emotional torment that gnawed at her, a constant dull ache in her chest. She replayed the scene in the dining hall over and over, the queen's cold gaze, the king's dismissive decree, Zola's triumphant sneer, and then there was Jabari's face, the blazing anger, the silent apology, the unspoken promise. A promise she now believed was foolish, impossible. He was a prince, she was a maid, now an outcast. Their worlds were irrevocably separated, or so she thought. Jabari, meanwhile, rode relentlessly. He followed the most likely path she would have taken, questioning travelers, searching for any sign, any whisper of a young woman matching her description. He knew he was taking an unimaginable risk. The king would be furious, the queen distraught. Search parties would undoubtedly be dispatched, not to find Aisha, but to bring him back. He was a prince, after all, a symbol, a commodity. His disappearance would send shockwaves through the kingdom, potentially sparking political instability, yet none of that mattered. All that consumed him was the image of Aisha, alone, vulnerable, and his fierce determination to find her. Days turned into a week, then two. Jabari's face grew gaunt from lack of sleep, his eyes red-rimmed, but still burning with resolve. He pushed Shadow to her limits, his body aching, but his will remained unbroken. He encountered suspicion, hostility, and dead ends. He spent his gold freely, offering rewards for information, knowing he was attracting unwanted attention, but unable to stop. Each passing day without a trace of her was a fresh wound, a gnawing fear that he was too late, that she had vanished into the vastness of the world, lost forever, and then a flicker of hope. In a small, dusty village on the fringes of the royal lands, a wizened old woman, her face a map of wrinkles, recognized Aisha from Jabari's description. "The quiet one," she mumbled, with the eyes like deep pools. "She passed through here, few days ago, headed towards the crossroads of whispers, seeking passage on a merchant caravan going west to the city of Kibwe. Kibwe, a sprawling, chaotic city hundreds of miles away. A melting pot of cultures, a place where one could easily disappear. It was a long, arduous journey, but it was a direction, a chance." Revitalized by this slender thread of information, Jabari pressed on, pushing Shadow even harder. He knew he had to reach Kibwe before Aisha vanished into its anonymity. He ate little, slept less, his mind focused solely on his mission. He traversed arid plains, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and forded swollen rivers, his royal upbringing stripped away, replaced by the raw, primal instinct of a man in pursuit of what he loved. Meanwhile, Aisha's journey was far more harrowing. The merchant caravan she joined was not a haven, but a continuation of her suffering. The merchants, rough and opportunistic, saw her vulnerability, her lack of connections. They overworked her, barely fed her, and subjected her to constant verbal abuse. She slept little, always with one eye open, the fear a constant companion. Her spirit, already battered, was nearing its breaking point. She longed for the quiet dignity of her maid's quarters, the predictability of her former life. Even the subtle torment of Zola seemed preferable to this desperate, uncertain existence. She found herself whispering Jabari's name into the wind, a desperate plea for a miracle she no longer believed in. One evening, as the caravan camped by a small, murky watering hole, the sky heavy with the threat of rain, Aisha was sent to gather firewood, a task usually reserved for the strongest men. Her ankle, still weak from her palace injury, throbbed with every step. As she knelt to pick up a fallen branch, one of the merchants, a burly man with a cruel laugh named Kale, approached her. He had been eyeing her for days, his gaze predatory. "Little bird," he slurred, his breath heavy with cheap alcohol, running away from home. "Are we? Perhaps you need a protector." His hand reached for her, his eyes glinting with malice. Aisha reacted on instinct. Years of navigating the unseen dangers of the palace, of anticipating hostility, had honed her reflexes. She grabbed a heavy, gnarled piece of wood and swung it, catching Kale hard on the side of his head. He staggered back, a look of shock and then furious rage contorting his face, lunged at her, no longer playing games, his intention clear. Aisha screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the desolate landscape. It was a scream that tore through the night, a sound that cut through the silence of the wilderness and pierced the exhaustion of a weary prince. Jabari, just a few miles away, pushing shadow through a dense thicket, heard it. It was a sound he knew, a sound that instantly ignited every protective instinct within him. He spurred Shadow forward, pushing her beyond her limits, a grim determination etched on his face. The screams grew louder, more desperate. He imagined the worst, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst through the last line of trees, Shadow skidding to a halt, and what he saw ignited a cold, righteous fury within him. Aisha was on the ground, struggling against Kale, who had pinned her. The other merchants, roused by the commotion, stood watching, some with leering smiles, others with indifferent expressions. "Get away from her," Jabari roared, his voice thick with unbridled rage, a sound that startled even the seasoned merchants. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his hand already on the hilt of his concealed dagger. Kale looked up, startled by the sudden appearance of this cloaked, authoritative figure. Before he could react, Jabari was on him, swift and precise. The dagger was out, a glint of silver in the faint moonlight. He didn't kill, but he delivered. A blow that was calculated to incapacitate, to inflict pain and shock. Kale screamed, clutching his arm, which was now bent at an unnatural angle. The other merchants, seeing the ferocity in Jabari's eyes, the royal bearing that no amount of travel dust could completely obscure, instinctively recoiled. This was no common traveler. Jabari turned to Aisha, who was scrambling to her feet, her eyes wide with disbelief, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "Aisha," he breathed, his voice thick with relief and pain. "Are you all right?" It was the same question he had asked her in the library, a question that now held the weight of a desperate journey, of unspoken longing. Aisha, seeing him, truly seeing him, a prince, her prince, risking everything for her, felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. Relief, joy, and an overwhelming, terrifying love. "Jabari," she whispered, his name a fragile prayer on her lips. She lunged forward, throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, as if afraid she would vanish again, his strong arms a refuge she had only dared to dream of. The world, for a moment, shrank to just the two of them, huddled together in the desolate wilderness, illuminated by the faint glow of the merchants' dying fire. The merchants, thoroughly intimidated, began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves, eager to distance themselves from this dangerous encounter. "We need to go," Jabari said, his voice hushed but firm. "They will know who I am soon enough. My father's guards will be looking for me." Aisha nodded, her heart still pounding, but a new exhilarating sense of hope blossoming within her. They mounted Shadow, Jabari taking the reins, Aisha riding pillion, clinging to him. They rode through the rest of the night, leaving the terrified merchants and their camp far behind. As the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, they found themselves on a high ridge overlooking a vast, sprawling landscape. "Where are we going?" Aisha asked, her voice still a little shaky, but filled with a new lightness. Jabari turned to her, his face weary, but his eyes shining with a fierce, defiant love. "To Kibwe," he said, "and beyond. To a place where we can be free, where we can finally, truly be together." The words hung in the crisp morning air, a declaration of war against tradition, against expectation, against the very fabric of their world. It was a terrifying prospect, a leap into the unknown, but as Aisha looked into Jabari's determined eyes, she felt an unshakable certainty. This was their path. This was their destiny. A kingdom might search for its lost prince and mourn, its discarded maid, but they would be long gone, forging a new life, a new legend on their own terms. The journey, however, had only just begun. The pursuit would intensify, the stakes would rise, and the true test of their love was yet to come. The dawn that greeted Aisha and Jabari as they rode away from the merchant. Camp wasn't just the beginning of a new day. It was the genesis of a new life, a life forged in defiance, steeped in uncertainty. They were two fugitives, a prince and a maid, bound not by decree or lineage, but by the fierce, unyielding current of a love that refused to be contained. The open road stretched before them, a dusty ribbon leading to the unknown. And behind them, the increasingly desperate pursuit of a king scorned and a kingdom in turmoil. King Theron's rage, upon discovering his son's disappearance, was a force of nature. It ripped through the palace, leaving courtiers trembling and servants scurrying for cover. His once unyielding features were now contorted with a mixture of fury and bewildered hurt. Queen Seraphina, ever the pragmatist, immediately understood the political implications. A missing prince was not merely a personal tragedy, it was a sign of weakness, a crack in the kingdom's foundation that ambitious rivals would be quick to exploit. The royal guard, led by the stoic and utterly loyal Captain Reza, a man whose face was as hard as granite and whose movements were as precise as a hawk's, was dispatched with orders to scour every inch of the royal lands to bring the prince back, by any means necessary. No mention was made of Aisha. She was merely the catalyst, the distraction that had led to this unthinkable breach of royal conduct. Jabari and Aisha rode relentlessly, pushing Shadow to her limits. Their destination was Kibwe, the sprawling city, a place where their identities might be swallowed by the sheer volume of humanity. But Kibwe was hundreds of miles away, across landscapes that tested their resilience at every turn. They conserved their dwindling coin, sharing meager meals of dried fruit and stale bread. Drawing water from hidden springs, Jabari remembered from his youthful explorations. Aisha, though physically exhausted, felt a lightness she hadn't known. In years, to be truly seen, truly valued by the man she loved, was a powerful antidote to years of oppression. Jabari, for his part, found a freedom he had only dreamed of. Stripped of his royal finery, riding through the wilderness. He was simply a man protecting the woman he loved. They knew they were hunted. Jabari, with his intimate knowledge of the royal guard's tactics, understood the relentless efficiency of Captain Reza. He chose less traveled paths, avoided major towns, and disguised their appearance whenever they had to pass through inhabited areas. Aisha, with her dark, expressive eyes, wore a simple head covering, obscuring her face. And Jabari affected the rough demeanor of a common trader, his princely bearing carefully masked. The constant tension was a living thing between them. A silent hum of awareness. Always listening, always watching. The days blurred into a grueling odyssey. They spoke in hushed tones, sharing their fears and their hopes. Aisha spoke of her childhood in a small village before her mother's death had forced her into palace servitude, of her quiet dreams of a life free from judgment. Jabari revealed the suffocating weight of his royal duties, the endless expectations, the isolation of his position, confessed his yearning for a life of purpose beyond mere ceremony. In these intimate conversations under the vast, star-strewn African sky, their bond deepened, becoming something unbreakable, forged in hardship and shared vulnerability. One night, as they rested near a winding river, the air thick with the chirping of crickets, Aisha stirred from a fitful sleep. A glint of metal in the distance caught her eye. She nudged Jabari awake, her voice a terrified whisper. Riders, she breathed, many of them. Jabari's heart seized, immediately recognized. The disciplined formation, the glint of royal insignia, even in the dim moonlight. Captain Reza. They had been found. Shadow, Jabari hissed, pulling Aisha to her feet. They leaped onto the mare, Jabari urging her forward with desperate commands. The chase was on. The Royal Guard, a disciplined unit of formidable warriors, gained on them swiftly. Ores whistled. Past, embedding themselves in the trees around them, Jabari, using his unparalleled horsemanship, weaved shadow through the dense forest. Dodging and feinting, trying to outmaneuver their pursuers, Aisha clung to him, her face buried in his back, a silent prayer on her lips. Captain Reza was relentless. He admired the prince's skill, but his duty was paramount. He saw the maid clinging to Jabari, confirming his deepest suspicions about the source of this aberration. He pushed his men harder, knowing the king would accept nothing less than the prince's immediate return. The pursuit lasted for what felt like an eternity. The thunder of hooves, the shouts of the guards, the rush of wind, terrifying symphony of desperation. As they burst out of the forest onto a rocky, uneven terrain, Shadow stumbled, her front leg buckling. Jabari, with a grunt of pain, managed to keep them both from being thrown, but he knew she couldn't continue at this pace. They were trapped. We have to dismount, yelled over the din, pulling Aisha off the horse. He looked at Shadow, his loyal companion, with anguish. Go, girl, run, he whispered, slapping her flank. The mare, intelligent and sensing their peril, whinnied once, then galloped away into the darkness. Drawing some of the pursuing guards with her, Jabari and Aisha scrambled into a small, rocky crevice, barely large enough to conceal them. They could hear the approaching guards, their heavy footsteps echoing on the stone. Don't move, Jabari whispered, drawing his dagger, his body tensed. Ready for a fight he couldn't possibly win against so many. He would protect her, to his last breath. The air grew thick with tension, the seconds stretching into an eternity. Just when they thought they were doomed, a series of sharp, guttural shouts erupted from behind the guards. A band of fierce, masked figures moving with the stealth of shadows emerged from the surrounding rocks. These were the desert nomads, a reclusive, fiercely independent tribe, known for their mastery of the treacherous terrain and their deep-seated distrust of royal authority. They rarely interfered in outside affairs, but the intrusion of the royal guard into their ancient hunting grounds was a provocation. The nomads engaged the guards in a swift, brutal skirmish, their curved blades flashing in the faint moonlight. They were not fighting to kill, but to drive the intruders from their territory. In the ensuing chaos, Jabari saw their chance. Grabbed Aisha's hand. Now, he hissed. They scrambled out of the crevice, moving silently, using the skirmish as cover. They ran, fueled by adrenaline, away from the sounds of battle, deeper into the desolate wilderness. The unexpected intervention of the nomads was a miracle, a desperate reprieve. But it meant they were now truly alone, far from any established paths. Vulnerable to the elements and whatever dangers the wild held, they walked through the rest of the night, their bodies aching, their minds numb with exhaustion. As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft pastels, they found themselves at the edge of a vast, shimmering desert. The Whispering Sands, as it was known, stretched endlessly before them, a sea of golden dunes, beautiful yet deadly. There was no going back. Their only path was forward, into the unknown. Kibwe now seemed an impossibly distant mirage. They faced thirst, hunger, and the scorching sun. Aisha, her resilience pushed to its limits, began to falter. Her steps grew heavy, her breath ragged. Jabari supported her, his arm around her waist, his own exhaustion warring with a fierce protective instinct. He knew they couldn't survive the desert without help, without supplies. His gaze swept the horizon, desperate, searching. And then he saw it, a plume of smoke, faint but distinct, rising from behind a cluster of distant dunes. It could be a mirage, a trick of the light, but it was their only hope. "Hold on, Aisha," he murmured. "We're almost there." He pulled her forward. One step at a time, their destination, an uncertain promise. Their hope, a fragile ember in the vast indifferent desert. They pressed on, the silence of the desert broken only by their labored breathing and the relentless thump of their weary hearts. As they neared the source of the smoke, a small makeshift encampment emerged from the shimmering heat haze. It was a group of oasis traders, seasoned desert travelers, who moved between the scattered watering holes, exchanging goods. They were a motley crew, their faces weathered by sun and sand, their eyes sharp and wary. Jabari, despite his disguise, approached. Cautiously, knowing their situation was precarious. They needed water, food, and passage. But they had little to offer in return. The traders eyed them suspiciously, their gazes lingering on Aisha's worn clothes and Jabari's disguised but still apparent noble bearing. One of the traders, a stout woman with a shrewd gaze and a missing front tooth named Mara, stepped forward. "Lost, aren't you?" Jabari, choosing his words carefully, explained they were travelers who had lost their way and their provisions. He offered the last of his gold coins, a small yet significant sum. Mara weighed the coin in her palm, her eyes assessing there. Desperation, a long, tense silence hung in the air. Mara's gaze moved from the gold to Aisha, then back to Jabari. She was shrewd, she understood a hidden story, a flight. But the gold was good, and their need was clear. Finally, she nodded. "We traveled to the city of Zahara," she said, naming a bustling desert trade hub even further from the royal lands. 2 days' journey across the sands. For passage and water, you will work. Every step of the way, it was a lifeline, harsh but undeniable. And so, Aisha and Jabari became temporary members of the Oasis traders. They shared the arduous work, loading and unloading goods, fetching water, tending to the camels. Aisha, despite her pain, worked tirelessly, her innate resilience shining through. Jabari, shedding any last vestiges of his royal upbringing, labored alongside her, proving his worth with every bead of sweat. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the desert, status meant nothing, only survival and the unwavering bond between them. They learned the rhythms of the desert, the importance of every drop of water, the beauty of the vast, star-filled nights. They were battered, bruised, but together. Their journey with the traders was a grueling test. But it also became a period of profound growth. They saw a world beyond the palace walls that was both harsher and more honest. They met people who lived by their wits and their strength, whose lives were defined by simple truths, not by elaborate protocols. Aisha found her voice, speaking up when needed, her opinions listened to. Jabari, stripped of his title, learned humility and true partnership. He realized that the greatest strength lay not in command, but in connection, in the shared burdens of a difficult path. As they finally approached the fortified walls of Zahara, a city carved from the reddish rock of the desert, a different kind of anxiety began to set in. Zahara was larger than any place Aisha had ever seen, a bustling nexus of trade routes, a melting pot of cultures. It was a place where they could truly disappear. But it was also a place of anonymity, a place where danger lurked in crowded souk and shadowy alleys. Their royal pursuers might not reach this far, but new threats, the anonymous perils of a sprawling city, awaited them. They entered Zahara under the cloak of twilight, a single weary figure clinging to the hope of a new beginning. They found a small, nondescript room in a quiet part of the city, a place far removed from the grand palaces they had once inhabited. They were no longer a prince and a maid. They were simply Jabari and Aisha, two souls seeking peace, a place to call their own. Their journey had been long, fraught with peril, but they had survived. They had faced down the wrath of a king, the dangers of the wild, and the relentless pursuit of their past. But the past, like a shadow, often lingers. The news of the prince's continued absence, and the whispers of his scandalous flight with a common maid, reached beyond the kingdom's borders. King Theron, his pride wounded, his authority challenged, had issued a decree that echoed across the continent. His son was to be brought back, no matter the cost, no matter how far he had run. The hunt was still on. And in the chaotic, anonymous streets of Zahara, the two lovers would soon discover that true escape was far more elusive than they could ever imagine. The illusion of safety was fragile, and the price of their freedom, perhaps, was yet to be fully paid. Zahara, the city of whispers and mirages. For Aisha and Jabari, it was meant to be a sanctuary, a sprawling anonymity where their past could finally be shed like desert dust. They had endured the king's wrath, outrun his guards, and survived the unforgiving wilderness. They had found each other against all odds, their love a beacon in the darkest night. But sometimes the greatest dangers aren't the ones that chase you, but the ones that lie hidden in plain sight, waiting in the crowded alleys of supposed freedom. Their new life in Zahara was a stark contrast to the opulence of the palace. Yet it was filled with a quiet dignity they had never truly known. They found a small single room in a bustling district, its walls thin, its window overlooking a cacophony of street life. It was humble, but it was theirs. Jabari, no longer a prince, used his keen intellect and his surprisingly practical skills to find work as a scribe, his elegant handwriting a commodity in a city that thrived on commerce. He quickly adapted his royal bearing, softening into a quiet confidence that drew people to him. Aisha, for her part, discovered a talent for weaving. Intricate patterns, her nimble fingers creating beautiful textiles that she sold in the vibrant souk. Her quiet resilience had blossomed into a gentle strength. Her eyes, though still holding a shadow of past hardship, now sparkled with a newfound purpose. They were just Jabari and Aisha, two ordinary people building a life together, brick by painstaking brick. They learned the rhythms of the city, its unspoken rules, its hidden kindnesses, and its lurking dangers. They found joy in the simplest things, sharing a warm meal, walking hand in hand through the bustling market, watching the sunset paint the desert sky from their tiny window. Their love, forged in the crucible of adversity, grew deeper, more profound with each passing day. They spoke of a future, of a small home, perhaps even children, dreams that had once been impossible fantasies. For the first time in their lives, they felt a fragile, precious sense of peace. But peace, like a desert oasis, can be fleeting. The king's reach, fueled by his injured pride and the desperate need to maintain his authority, was long. News of the runaway prince, a scandalous tale of forbidden love, had spread across the kingdoms, reaching even the distant, bustling trade city of Zahara. King Theron, advised by his cunning queen, had offered a staggering reward for information leading to the prince's capture and return. He had dispatched his most discreet and ruthless agents, men who operated in the shadows, their loyalty unwavering, their methods merciless. One afternoon, as Aisha sat weaving in their small room, a chill wind seemed to sweep through the open window, a familiar, sickeningly sweet scent of jasmine. The signature perfume worn by the queen's ladies-in-waiting wafted into the room. Aisha froze, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She recognized it instantly. It was a scent that had haunted her nightmares in the palace, a fragrance associated with veiled threats and subtle cruelty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the street below. Nothing seemed amiss, just the usual throng of merchants and citizens. But a gut feeling, a primal instinct honed by years of living in fear, screamed at her. They were being watched. The fragile bubble of their peace was about to burst. When Jabari returned later that evening, his face weary but his eyes alight with affection, Aisha pulled him inside, her voice a hushed, desperate whisper. "They're here," she breathed, the queen sent. I smelled it. We have to go, now. Jabari's face paled. He knew Aisha's instincts were rarely wrong. He had grown to trust her quiet observations, her acute sensitivity to danger. The very idea that his family's agents had managed to track them to Zahara, a city hundreds of miles away, filled him with a cold dread. They had been so careful, so anonymous. But his father's resources and his mother's cunning were truly boundless. "We need to leave the city tonight," he said, his voice firm, already planning. "We don't know who has seen us, who has reported us. Every second we stay is a risk." They gathered their few belongings, the small pouch of coins they had managed to save, the simple clothes they now wore. They moved with a silent urgency, their movements synchronized, a testament to their shared journey. Under the cover of the deepest night, they slipped out of their rented room, melting into the shadows of Zahara's labyrinthian alleys. Their goal, the city gates, and beyond them, the open desert once more. But this time, they were prepared. They'd learned from their previous escape. As they neared the main gate, they saw them. Figures cloaked in dark robes, moving with a disciplined, predatory grace. Not the royal guard this time, but the king's discreet agents, lethal and silent. They were searching every person entering and leaving the city. It was a trap. Their path to the desert was blocked. Jabari cursed under his breath. He knew these men. They were trained to capture, not to kill, unless provoked. But they would not hesitate to inflict pain, to break spirits. Aisha, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, felt a surge of despair. They were cornered. Just as she thought they were doomed, Jabari's eyes caught sight of a less guarded, smaller gate, typically used by merchants transporting livestock or goods to the outskirts of the city. It was a long shot, riskier, but it was their only chance. "Follow me," he whispered, grabbing her hand. They merged with a group of late-night vendors, their faces obscured by the dim light. Their presence unremarkable amidst the noise of the city, they managed to slip through the smaller gate, blending into the last few stragglers leaving the city. Before the nightly lockdown, they breathed a collective sigh of relief as the heavy gates creaked shut behind them. They were out, but now, where to go? The desert stretched before them, vast and intimidating, but also a shield against the eyes of the king's agents. "Head for the coast," Jabari decided, his voice resolute. "There are fishing villages, port towns. We can find a ship, go somewhere entirely new, somewhere they will never think to look." The journey to the coast was another arduous test. They walked avoiding roads, relying on Jabari's innate navigational skills and Aisha's growing resilience. They faced hunger and exposure, but they faced it together. The image of the glittering sea, a symbol of endless possibilities, spurred them onward. After weeks of relentless travel, exhausted and emaciated, they finally caught their first glimpse of the ocean, a vast expanse of shimmering blue meeting the horizon. It was a sight that brought tears to Aisha's eyes, tears of relief, of a hope that finally felt tangible. They had made it. They found a small, isolated fishing village nestled in a rocky cove. Far from any major port, a place where strangers were rarely questioned. They adopted new names, new histories. Jabari, with his quick mind, quickly learned the ways of the sea, securing work on a fishing boat. Aisha, her hands still skilled, helped mend nets and prepared the daily catch, her quiet presence a comfort to the villagers. Life in the fishing village was hard, dictated by the relentless rhythms of the tide and the unpredictable bounty of the sea. But it was honest. It was free. They lived in a small, whitewashed hut, the scent of salt and fish always in the air. They watched the sun rise over the endless ocean and set over the distant mountains. They shared quiet moments on the beach, their hands intertwined, their dreams taking on a new, simpler form. The fear of discovery gradually receded, replaced by a sense of belonging, a fragile happiness that felt almost too good to be true, and perhaps it was. News travels slowly in forgotten villages, but it travels nonetheless. King Theron's relentless pursuit had continued, his agents following every lead, every whisper. The reward for the prince's return had been increased, a king's desperate gamble. to reclaim his lost son and restore his shattered pride. This time, the agents sought out the remote, the overlooked, the places where a prince and a former maid might think themselves safe. One market day, as Jabari was helping unload the day's catch, a group of unfamiliar men arrived in the village. They moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of training, of purpose. Their eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the villagers, searching, always searching. One of them, a man with a distinctive scar across his brow, lingered near Aisha's stall, his gaze too long, too sharp. Aisha felt a cold dread creep up her spine. The whispers had found them. She tried to warn Jabari, to meet his eyes across the busy market, but it was too late. The scarred man gave a subtle signal, and the other agents moved with lightning speed. Jabari, caught off guard, was tackled from behind. He struggled fiercely, fighting with the desperation of a man protecting his freedom, but the agents were many, and they were ruthless. Aisha screamed, a sound torn from her very soul, rushing forward, her hands instinctively clawing at the men, trying to reach him. She was pushed aside brutally. "Jabari," she cried, her voice raw with terror. He was being dragged towards a waiting boat, his hands bound, a gag quickly pressed over his mouth. He looked at her, his eyes wide with anguish, a silent apology, a desperate promise. The last image she saw was his face, contorted in defiance and despair. Before he was forced onto the boat, which immediately began to pull away from the shore, its sails catching the wind, she ran to the water's edge, screaming his name until her voice was hoarse, her heart shattering with every receding wave. The villagers, terrified, kept their distance, unwilling to intervene in something that clearly involved the powerful. Aisha collapsed on the sand, utterly broken, watching as the boat, carrying the love of her life, vanished into the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. He was gone, captured, dragged back to the gilded cage he had so bravely escaped. But even in that moment of utter despair, something flickered within Aisha, a memory of Jabari's defiance, a whisper of his strength, a silent echo of his unyielding love. They had fought so hard, endured so much. She had faced persecution, ostracization, and the raw brutality of the wilderness. She had found love, lost it, and found it again. She had survived. If he had instilled one thing in her, it was the belief that surrender was not an option. Fear was immense, the grief overwhelming, but beneath it, a tiny ember of determination began to glow. They had taken him, but they hadn't taken her. And she would not simply wait, broken and defeated. She would find him. She would fight. She would remind them that a maid, once dismissed, once cast out, could become a force to be reckoned with, capable of moving mountains for the man she loved. The happy ending they had so desperately sought had been snatched away, but the story was far from over. It was time for Aisha, the quiet maid, to become the true heroine of her own destiny, to defy a king and reclaim her prince. The final, perilous chapter was about to begin. The ocean, which had once promised boundless freedom, now felt like a vast, cruel expanse, swallowing the last vestiges of Aisha's hope. The boat carrying Jabari had vanished beyond the horizon, taking with it not just her beloved, but the future they had painstakingly built. Yet, as the bitter salt spray lashed her face, a new kind of fire ignited within her. The quiet, compliant maid was gone. In her place stood Aisha, a woman forged by hardship, stripped of fear, and driven by an unyielding love. She would not mourn. She would act. News of the prince's capture rippled through the kingdom, sparking both relief and renewed political maneuvering. King Theron, his authority temporarily restored, swiftly declared Jabari's return to duty, a thinly veiled euphemism for his imprisonment. He was confined to his chambers, guarded relentlessly, his every move watched. His very existence reduced to a symbol of the king's unchallenged power. The Queen Seraphina wasted no time. With the distraction of Aisha removed, she accelerated plans for Jabari's arranged marriage to Princess Amara of the Eastern Dominion, a union designed to solidify alliances and secure the kingdom's future. Amara was a woman of formidable beauty and sharp intellect, raised to understand the demands of power. She had heard the whispers of the prince's forbidden love, dismissing it as a childish fantasy, an inconvenience to be quickly forgotten. Back, in the desolate fishing village, Aisha refused to be consumed by despair. Her mind, once focused on simple survival, now honed itself into a weapon. She sought out the village elders, their faces etched with the wisdom of the sea, listened intently to their tales of distant ports, of hidden currents, of ships that sailed beyond the reach of kings. She learned of smuggling routes, of captains who asked no questions, of ways to disappear and reappear in unexpected places. She sold what little she had, her few remaining handmade textiles, anything to gather coin. Her goal was clear: to reach the capital, to face the very heart of the power that had stolen her love. Aisha secured passage on a small, battered cargo ship heading north, its destination a bustling port city roughly a week's journey from the capital. She worked for her passage, mending nets, cleaning decks, her body aching but her spirit unyielding. On the open sea, under the vast, indifferent sky, she plotted. She remembered every detail Jabari had ever shared about the palace, its secret passages, its changing of the guard, the subtle weaknesses in its formidable defenses. She remembered the names of sympathetic servants, the routines of the royal family. She was no longer just a maid. She was an architect of rescue. When she finally reached the northern port, she merged seamlessly into the teeming crowds. No longer the frightened, quiet girl. Her eyes, once pools of apprehension, now held a fierce, determined light. She dyed her hair a darker shade, donned the rough clothes of a common laborer, and moved with a newfound confidence. She found work in the city's sprawling market, her keen observation skills proving invaluable. She listened to the whispers, the rumors, the official pronouncements from the capital. She learned of the impending royal wedding, a grand spectacle, designed to erase any memory of the prince's scandal. Time was running out. The palace, meanwhile, was abuzz with preparations for the royal wedding. Banners fluttered, musicians practiced, and chefs prepared lavish feasts. But beneath the veneer of celebration, a tension hung heavy in the air. Prince Jabari, confined to his tower chambers, refused to eat, refused to speak, his defiance, silent yet powerful, challenged to his father's will. His once vibrant eyes were now shadowed, filled with a deep, consuming despair. He knew his fate was sealed. He would be forced to marry a woman he didn't love, to become a puppet in his family's grand design. His only comfort was the faint, lingering memory of Aisha's touch, her courage, her unwavering love. He believed she was safe, free, far from the clutches of his family. He could not know the true depth of her resilience, her desperate plan. Back in the city, Aisha began to formulate her plan, a desperate, audacious scheme that relied on stealth, cunning, and a healthy dose of audacity. She needed help, but trust was a dangerous luxury. She sought out the underbelly of the city, the shadowy figures who dealt in information, in favors, and the impossible. She heard whispers of a network of disillusioned former palace servants, men and women who had suffered under the king's rigid rule, some of whom had been friends of her late mother. One name surfaced repeatedly: Juma, an old, disgraced stablemaster, renowned for his knowledge of the palace's hidden passages and his deep-seated resentment of the current regime. It took all of Aisha's newfound courage to approach Juma. He was a gruff, weathered man, his face a roadmap of hard living, his eyes perpetually suspicious. She found him in a smoky tavern, nursing a cheap brew. She spoke to him in hushed tones, revealing her true identity, recounting Jabari's flight, his capture, and the impending forced marriage. Juma listened, his expression unreadable, his eyes shrewdly assessing her sincerity, her desperation. He remembered Aisha's mother, a kind woman who had helped him in his own time of need. He saw the fierce light in Aisha's eyes, a reflection of the prince's own rebellious spirit. He knew the palace, its secrets, its vulnerabilities. He made his decision. "It is a fool's errand," Juma rasped, his voice rough, "but a prince's heart is not something to be trifled with. And a promise, once made, must be kept." He would help her. Juma laid out a plan, intricate and perilous. It involved infiltrating the palace during the chaos of the wedding preparations, using old forgotten servant tunnels, and exploiting the distractions of the grand celebration. Aisha would enter the palace disguised as a vendor, carrying goods. To the kitchens, a familiar face in the background. Juma would create a diversion, drawing attention away from their true objective. Their target, Jabari's tower chamber. Deep within the heavily guarded royal wing, the day of the royal wedding dawned. A symphony of trumpets and joyous pronouncements, masking the desperate machinations within. The palace glittered with 1,000 candles, its courtyards overflowing with dignitaries from across the land. Inside his chamber, Prince Jabari, dressed in ceremonial robes, looked out at the festive crowds with a profound emptiness in his eyes. This was his prison, his gilded cage, and his wedding day would be his final surrender. He saw no way out. Aisha, disguised as a baker's assistant, her face smudged with flour, her heart pounding like a war drum, slipped through the palace gates. She moved with a practiced ease, her years as a maid serving her well. She knew these corridors, these faces, these hidden passages. She navigated the labyrinthine kitchens, the air thick with the aroma of roasted meats and sweet pastries, her eyes constantly scanning, searching for her opportunity. Juma, meanwhile, set his diversion into motion, a well-timed accident in the outer stables that drew a significant portion of the royal guard away from their posts. Chaos erupted in the outer palace. Alarm bells rang. Guards rushed to the stables, their attention diverted. This was Aisha's chance. She moved swiftly, disappearing into a forgotten servant's tunnel, a narrow, dusty passage known only to a few. She moved through the darkness, guided by memory and pure instinct, her hand clutching a small, sharp knife hidden beneath her apron. She emerged into a dimly lit corridor in the royal wing, her heart thundering. She reached Jabari's tower chamber. 2 heavily armed guards stood outside, their attention momentarily distracted by the distant commotion. Aisha knew she couldn't fight them. She needed a different approach. She glanced around, her eyes darting until she spotted it. A heavy, ornate tapestry hanging on the wall, directly above a sturdy, unused wooden crate. With a silent prayer, she climbed onto the crate, grasping the top of the tapestry. With a surge of adrenaline, she ripped it down, creating a sudden, loud commotion that startled the guards. "What was that?" one guard exclaimed, turning his back to the door for a crucial second. In that split second, Aisha darted past them, a silent blur, and slammed herself against the heavy wooden door to Jabari's chamber. It was locked. She frantically searched for the key, her fingers fumbling. But then she remembered something Jabari had told her, a detail about a loose stone above the door, a secret cache. Her fingers found it, a small, cold key. The lock clicked open. She burst inside, startling Jabari, who had been staring blankly out the window. His eyes, clouded with despair, widened in disbelief as he saw her, standing there, a vision of impossible hope. "Aisha," he whispered, his voice hoarse, tears springing to his eyes. He rushed to her, pulling her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. "You came. We have to go, now." Aisha urged, pulling away, her gaze resolute. The sound of the guards' heavy boots echoed in the corridor. They had realized her trick. Jabari, revitalized by her presence, by the sheer audacity of her rescue, immediately understood. He had a plan, a risky one. He pointed to a high, narrow window, overlooking a treacherous precipice that dropped into the roaring river below. "The only way out," he stated, "is down." Aisha didn't hesitate. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. They quickly fashioned a makeshift rope from the heavy drapes, Jabari testing its strength. Just as the guards began to bash on the door, they climbed out, lowering themselves down the sheer rock face. The wind whipping at their faces, the roar of the river a deafening symphony below. It was a perilous descent, a single misstep meaning certain death. But together, they were a force, their trust in each other absolute. They reached the bottom, bruised and scraped but alive. The river raged, its current strong. "We swim, Jabari," declared, taking her hand. They plunged into the icy water, the force of the current immediately trying to drag them under. Jabari, a strong swimmer, pulled Aisha through the churning water, battling the treacherous eddies, their bodies aching, their lungs burning. They emerged on the far bank, gasping for air, collapsing onto the damp earth. They were safe, for now. The river separated them from the palace, from the king's agents, from the wedding that would never happen. But they were deep in the wilderness, far from any path, vulnerable and exposed. Jabari looked at Aisha, his eyes shining with profound love and respect. "You saved me," he whispered. "You truly saved me." Aisha smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her exhausted face. "We saved each other," she corrected, her voice soft but firm. They walked through the remaining hours of the night, holding hands, their hearts beating as one. As the first rays of dawn touched the eastern sky, painting the world in hues of soft gold and rose, they saw it. A quiet village nestled in a verdant valley, smoke curling from its chimneys. It was a place untouched by royal decrees, a haven of peace and simplicity. They had found their sanctuary. They'd found work, simple but honest, building a small life together. Jabari, no longer a prince, used his knowledge of the world to help. The villagers, sharing wisdom from books, helping them with their harvests. Aisha, the former maid, nurtured a small garden, her hands once calloused from palace chores. Now tenderly tending to life, they married under the ancient, sprawling baobab tree in the center of the village, their vows simple, heartfelt, witnessed only by the kind villagers who had welcomed them. There were no trumpets, no royal fanfare, no grand pronouncements. Just the quiet joy of two souls finally finding their true home. They built a small house with their own hands, its walls made of earth and straw, its roof thatched with reeds. It was humble, but it was filled with love, laughter, the quiet contentment of lives truly lived. Their story, whispered from village to village, became a legend, a testament to the power of love over power, of freedom over convention. The king eventually accepted his son's choice, though his pride never fully healed. The kingdom moved on, but the legend of the prince and the maid who defied a kingdom for love endured. They had found their happily ever after, not in a grand palace, but in the quiet embrace of a life truly chosen, a love truly earned. It was a love story that began with a whisper in a forgotten corner of a palace, grew in defiance of kings and deserts, and finally blossomed in the humble peace of a village, proving that the strongest crowns are not worn on the head, but in the heart. When two souls are finally, truly free, the end. Don't forget to like, comment, and share so others get to watch too. Subscribe for more.